Hello and welcome to a special episode of To The Point devoted entirely to Prime Minister Modi's visit to China. Yesterday, the Prime Minister received an unprecedented and spectacular welcome from the Chinese President in Xi'an. Today, he's had far-reaching but even possibly path-breaking discussions with the Chinese Prime Minister in Beijing. So how should we assess this visit? What should we make of the decisions on the border dispute, trade, investment and people-to-people contacts? And are India-China relations hereafter on a significantly different trajectory? I have with me a panel of guests who are perhaps better informed than most others. They are India's former ambassador to China, Chandrasekhar Das Gupta, the geostrategic director of the IISS, Sanjay Baru, a senior fellow from the Centre for Policy Research, Srinath Raghavan, the Foreign Affairs Editor of the Hindustan Times, Pramit Pal Chaudhary, and a research fellow from King's College London, Zorawar Daulat Singh. Mr. Das Gupta, before we come to the details of what's been achieved, as well as the areas where perhaps not that much progress was made, let's start with the incredible welcome and reception that the Prime Minister's got from President Xi in Xi'an, and then today from President Li in Beijing. Was China, in your eyes, sending out a deliberate message through this grand reception and through the fact that the President, for the first time ever, has travelled outside the capital to receive a visiting leader?
Well, I think the latter part, is travelling to Xi'an to receive our Prime Minister, was a reciprocal gesture because Mr. Modi had received him in Gujarat. And Xi'an is also a very appropriate place to start this sort of a venture, both because it recalls the historic contacts between China and India, and also because it will play a central role in the new Silk Route, the new
What
Chinese...
about the pageantry, the banquet, all the entertainment? Was that special?
Absolutely. I believe Amir Khan is in China these days to do a joint venture film with the Chinese. I think you could pick up some very useful tips from Chinese protocol officers on how to create a spectacular backdrop for scenes.
So this is in fact special treatment for the Indian Prime Minister?
Well, I don't know. He might do it again for another visitor. But the Chinese mastery of creating spectacles, we saw that in the Olympics. And you're seeing something of that repeated here.
Srinath Raghavan, let's come to the Prime Minister's statement. He said China is one of our most important strategic partnerships. After admitting that this is a complex relationship, he then added he was committed to set a new direction. How do you read this commitment to a new direction?
Well, I think what the Prime Minister was trying to say was that, this is a relationship where you have elements of competition, elements of cooperation, and that you really need to sort of try and mitigate the competition bits, and accelerate on the second. And what he's trying to do really is a set of things. I think the other thing which Mr. Modi has really made an attempt to, which I think we must recognize for what it is also to try and set the India-China relationship in a wider global context. For instance, the decision to issue a separate joint statement on climate change, I think is quite significant. It suggests that India and China can work together on the global stage on issues which are of vital concern to each other. And that itself sets a new compass for the way the relationship will develop.
But when you talk of setting a new compass, when the Prime Minister talks about setting a new direction, is that in fact an indication that he wants to either lift this relationship to a different trajectory, or he wants to reorient it so that it is significantly different in its handling to the way it's been handled in the past?
I think it's a bit of both. He does want to bring in new elements which will give it greater sort of depth, complexity, more dimensionality, but at the same time try and press ahead on issues that have been outstanding for a very long time now.
Sanjay Baru, the Prime Minister said something that I found particularly important, and I'm going to quote him to you. He said, "I stressed the need for China to reconsider its approach on some of the issues that hold us back from realizing the full potential of our partnership." And then he added, "I suggest that China should take a strategic and long-term view of our relations." Now there clearly the Prime Minister is publicly calling on China to change its attitude to India, but not necessarily indicating whether he's going to make a similar change beyond this talk of a new commitment. How do you read this public comment to China?
No, I think you read it absolutely correctly, Karan. This is really Prime Minister Modi at the end of 1 year of going around the world to Japan, to Russia, to the United States, to all the other BRIC countries, finally going to China and saying, take a long-term view. We are here. We are a rising nation. We are a growing economy. We are Asia's biggest democracy. We are your neighbor. We have survived 60 years as a democracy. Take us seriously. Take a long-term view. And don't try to needle us, unnecessarily in our neighborhood. Think about India and China in a 100-year perspective, 200-year perspective. From beginning of civilization, we have lived in peace. And just because we have had some problems in the last few years, and just because you have grown at a phenomenal rate in the last 30 years, that's really in the last 30 years. I mean, China's takeoff, no country should be assumed that it will continue to take off. So please take us a little more seriously and take a long-term view. And we are going to be around, both of us are going to be neighbors forever and ever and ever. So let us live in peace.
But my point in a sense was that not just is the Prime Minister telling China to take a long-term view and that we're around for a long time with each other, but this is the first time I remember an Indian Prime Minister publicly telling his host to actually reassess and relook at the relationship. Normally these are things said behind closed doors. Here it was said publicly on television. Did you not find that both courageous and unusual?
Actually, no. Let me correct you. In some senses, this was the message from India in the period 2003 to 2010. When Jiabao met Manmohan Singh, and we're talking about the whole world is looking at India and China. When India and China meet, the whole world is looking at us. You look at the rhetoric of that relationship in that period, there was a lot of this at that time. But what has happened in the last 4-5 years is that India has gone down. People start giving up on India. Okay. And on the other hand, China has become more assertive, much more self-confident, and under Xi Jinping, a much more powerful nation. And so there was a certain reassessment probably that, China is now here to stay. Is the G2, United States on the one side, China on the other side, the superpowers. India is just like any other emerging economy, not something that one should take too seriously. So I think Prime Minister Modi is basically saying, no, don't take that view of India. We are back in business, and take us a little more seriously.
Pramit Chaudhary, in response to the two statements that I've quoted of our Prime Minister, right, Premier Lee said, we have more in common than our differences. Additionally, our Foreign Secretary at his press conference revealed that Premier Lee had admitted that the image of the two countries in the past was that of adversaries. Right. Now he wanted them to project a positive partnership. Yeah. Do you therefore get the feeling that in terms of sentiment, in terms of broad vision, the two Prime Ministers are not just using the same rhetoric, but they're very much on the same wavelength?
Well, I think, and if you look at the joint statement, there's a reference to to India, the rise of India and China being the combination ensuring the realization of the Asian century. In other words, for me, what I saw in that was that the Chinese were effectively, and I would argue they didn't fully admit this in the past, that it's actually in their benefit that India rises. It is in their economic benefit, and to some larger, broader degree, it's beneficial to the stability of the periphery of China that India does well.
And so this is why the Chinese Prime Minister said it's important hereafter we project the image of partnership.
Yes, and because look at it from the Chinese perspective, across the Pacific coastline, they are now effectively having a territorial or maritime dispute with everybody from Indonesia to Japan. They are looking at Russia, which is clearly on the decline, but it is not going to clearly be much of a partner over the next 20 years, except as a mineral resource base. Their two greatest allies are North Korea, which is insane, and Pakistan, which is going off a cliff. And so they're looking around and saying, actually, India doesn't look too bad in all of this. On top of that, India, as a $2 trillion economy, about to overtake them in growth rates, is a market that is actually useful for Xi Jinping's own economic reform program at home.
You're saying something very interesting. You're saying, in fact, that China is of its own volition and of its own requirement actually undertaking the reassessment that Mr. Modi asked them to do.
Yes.
They are, for their own reasons, already relooking at India and taking a strategic
It's completely self-interest.
Let's then, Zorawar Daulat Singh, in this context, come to the specific issues between the two countries that need to be resolved. Now, on the border, the Prime Minister said that he had reiterated the importance of clarification of the line of actual control. When he was asked, the Foreign Secretary said that there was a healthy discussion on this subject, but he didn't say a word more than that. Do you get the feeling that the Chinese are reluctant to commit themselves to clarification of the LAC?
Yes, but before that, let me just make a point on the framework that has been guiding.
Quickly.
Yeah, so basically the old framework was we're going to work of solving this dispute and we're going to work on our common interests. What happened is in the last 10 years we're seeing the common interests are being held back by the dispute. So as much as India and China are saying we can separate them, they can't be separated. So what you see today is the Prime Minister for the first time is bringing the entire political relationship onto one single
I'm
platform.
afraid I'm going to have to stop you, Zorawar. Your mic has fallen and your voice is not being carried. I'll come back to you in a moment's time. Let me, in a sense, put that question to you, Mr. Dasgupta. Do you get the feeling that the Chinese are not as keen on clarification of the LAC, which is why the Foreign Secretary rather diplomatically said there was a healthy discussion, even though the Prime Minister said that he had reiterated the importance of clarification?
Absolutely. I think your interpretation is correct, that the Chinese are not at this point interested in clarification of the line.
Why aren't they interested in it?
There could be different reasons. Perhaps there is a feeling that once you've settled the line of actual control, effectively over a period of time, the status quo remaining unchanged, it means that the status quo becomes converted into an actual
In other
border.
words, clarifying the line of control could lead to a solution which may not be the solution they want, so why clarify? To what extent do you agree with that?
I think so. I think they're worried that if they clarify, India will treat it like the LOC with Pakistan and sort of just freeze it. They want a final settlement, but they could also be sort of a more, let's say, a sinister interpretation, which allows them, an undefined LAC allows them to use their military superiority to keep India sort of on the back foot, deploy on the frontiers, invest in its military modernization. So I think
uncertainty plays to their advantage.
And let me just complete why. The Chinese want a larger political trust to be established with India before they settle. They don't want this sort of a piecemeal approach which then gets frozen.
Now, Srinath Raghavan, in that particular context, where it's quite clear that the Chinese are not going to pay much heed to our Prime Minister's reiteration of the importance of clarification of the LAC, how do you read what the Foreign Secretary said about the fact that a fair amount of time was spent discussing the border, and as a result, the two sides have agreed to expand border meeting points and activate a hotline between their two army headquarters? Is that significant, or is that just the sort of confidence-building measure you would accept, but not a major achievement?
Well, it is a confidence-building measure, and all confidence-building measures are not just cumulative, but they also have a sort of a sum of the part. Sum is usually greater than the parts. When a number of things are working together, usually have greater capacity within the system to manage crises. But yes, it is very much a confidence-building measure. It is nowhere as close as coming to, say, clarification of the LAC, let alone setting the boundary.
Let's come to the economic issues, which are also a major issue of concern, and I think the trade deficit, there is a particular one from the Indian standpoint, has gone up to an astonishing $48 billion recently. Now, the Foreign Secretary announced that a high-powered task force has been set up, which will go into the trade deficit, IT issues, farmer issues, as well as agricultural and manufacturing issues. Do you read into this a significant and sympathetic response from China to India's concern about the trade deficit? Or do you get the feeling that when you leave things to a committee, which is effectively what a high-powered task force is, it's a way of shelving the problem rather than solving it?
Well, I think in this case, we'll see exactly what happens on the implementation side on China. We've had statements before about China giving us greater access and nothing much has happened. Now, what they've done here is they specifically mentioned the actual non-tariff barriers that act as a blockade to Indian imports and including service exports to China. So phytosanitary measures are exactly how they stop Indian agricultural and meat products from entering China. So we said, okay, we'll set up a team to look exactly, go through your regulations and see where exactly we're having difficulties and see whether you can modify or we can adjust. We'll go through the IT services problems that we face. Why exactly is it that TCS or Wipro cannot bag a contract in China? will go through the ground. And for India, I think now the game is to see whether or not China actually delivers on this.
But you're saying something very interesting. You're saying the specificity is actually assuring to us, because it suggests that they're aware and taking on board what exactly we believe are the problems, and they will address them.
Right. So
what we
rather than
don't
just-
know is whether they'll deliver.
Yeah. So rather than just saying, oh, we'll give you market access as a broad statement, we're going into the micro detail and saying, okay, exactly where is this not working? And then we'll see. Now, if these joint groups that sit down and work through all of these little rules and regulations actually succeed, then we should start to see, and pharmaceuticals, again, another product that we are competitive in, will start to enter the Chinese
So you're
market.
actually hopeful that we will see significant, meaningful steps being taken eventually, maybe not immediately, to address the trade deficit.
My assumption would be China would not accept all of these unless they actually felt that there was some reason to do this positively.
Sanjay Baru, one of the economic areas of cooperation that hasn't made visible progress are the two Chinese industrial parks in Maharashtra and Gujarat. Barely 20% of the land required in either case has actually been acquired. And here, there's no doubt, the ball, so to speak, is in the Indian court. Is there a danger, given the lethargic way we in India move on such issues, that we could end up putting off Chinese investment, and some of that $20 billion that President Xi promised in September might actually slip out of our hands?
Of course there is that danger. I mean, it's not just the Chinese. The South Koreans have been waiting forever to come and set up a steel plant in India, and are on the verge of giving it up. I mean, day after tomorrow, Prime Minister Modi is in Seoul, and I'm pretty sure this issue will come up in South Korea. When India asks for more investment, the South Koreans will say, what about the investment we tried to bring in? And you know, you're still stuck in Orissa, the POSCO steel plant. It's a generalized problem. India is unable to find the land and to create the framework for investment, not just for foreigners, for Indians. I mean, more Indian companies are now investing outside India than they are in India. And this is one of the weak points of Prime Minister Modi's 1 year in office, that he has done exceedingly well on foreign policy, but not adequately well on domestic economic policy, partly because of the problems in Parliament, but partly because I think the government has not been as focused. So I'm pretty sure that the Chinese will find all manner of alibis if they don't want to come to India. But if they do want to come to India, you know, like the Koreans overtook the Japanese, they have the potential to actually come and overtake others because they have the money. So if they have the will, they can do it.
Can I ask you a quick question? Give me a short answer. What is your gut feeling? Will that 20 billion offered by President Xi in September be realized within 5 years? Or will the Chinese find an alibi for not doing so? Or will we have put up obstacles because we haven't delivered in terms of industrial parks and the land and on the infrastructure? So what's your feeling? No matter what the problem, will that 20 billion be realized?
Frankly, I think frankly we should focus on infrastructure as far as China is concerned. I don't think manufacturing, we should expect too much from China. The manufacturing sector is where we should really be seeking Japanese and Korean and Taiwanese investment into India, and German for investment into India. But it's an infrastructure that we can really reach out to China and hope that China will put in more money, and there's large, you know, cross-continental projects.
Let's come, Mr. Dasgupta, to two political issues that have always been thorny and awkward and difficult between our two countries. Now, the joint statement says that on the United Nations Security Council, China, and I'm quoting, understands and supports India's aspiration to play a greater role in the UN, including the Security Council. Does understanding and supporting India's aspiration, but that's simply defined as playing a greater role without saying what the greater role is, actually means support for a permanent seat at the Council, or is China hedging?
China is hedging. Look, we have a mixed picture where cooperation in multilateral fora are concerned. On the positive side, we have things like climate change, where there's a commonality of interest because
I'll come to climate change later. Stick to this for now.
Here, you see, where in issues where China already has an assured seat at the high table, it has not been responsive to India's attempts to find a chair for itself. That applies to the Security Council, it applies to the Nuclear Suppliers Group, Here, China is a member of the established order.
And
it
they
has a
therefore
seat on
have
the
no
high
interest
table,
in bringing
and
us in.
they have no particular interest.
So the initial sense of euphoria on television channels that this sentence had been interpreted by them as support for India's membership as a permanent member was mistaken. That was mistaken.
Well, if that was the impression, certainly it's mistaken. All they're saying is that they are not actively opposing it. They are not saying that they support it. And then there's a reference to the nuclear supplies.
I'll come to the nuclear supplies group tomorrow, but on UNSC, they're not opposing it, they're not supporting it, and what they're supporting is an undefined greater role.
That's right.
Which doesn't have to be full membership.
That's right.
Let's come to the NSG, because there's the Rawat Daulat thing. In fact, their joint statement is even more intriguing, because all it says is the Chinese side took note of India's aspirations to become a member of the NSG. That's virtually like saying, I hear what you want, and leaving it at that. They haven't indicated whether they approve of what we want, leave aside support what we want. So here, we've got very little from them.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I think on this issue, the Chinese have tried to sort of keep parity with Pakistan, and they want to link India's entry into the international arms control system with. But on the UNSC, let me make one more point. I think from the Chinese point of view, they see India's ambition to go to the UN linked with Japan. And I think that was our earlier strategy, where we teamed up with the Japanese for the UN. If we were to make an independent posture that we are on our own right, deserve to be there, not the G4, I think with Brazil, Germany and Japan, then I think the Chinese will change their posture. So I think
when you say
they are blocking India's explicit position on India because it's linked with Japan.
Let me interrupt you. When you say that if we de-link ourselves from the G4, you think China will support us, is that your hunch, or do you have some reason
that's
to
a
believe
conjecture, but I feel you have a more chance of getting an explicit sort of a position from the Chinese.
You're nodding your head in disagreement.
Yes, that's right, because the Chinese have added a rider, which is that provided there's consensus in the Asian group, and they know that Pakistan will ensure.
So they have another
that
blocking mechanism, don't they? They have another blocking mechanism. Let me come, Srinath Raghavan, to two other developments which may have got drowned out with all the concentration of the discussion on the political or on the economic side of this visit. First, the Prime Minister said, and I'm quoting him, that an area of high priority is people-to-people contacts. And then he added, Indian and Chinese people don't know each other well, much less understand each other. How, firstly, significant is this admission? And then secondly, to what extent is it effectively tackled by establishing a Center for Gandhian and Indian Studies in Shanghai, a yoga college in Kunming, and a series of bilateral think tanks?
Well, I don't think I'm in a position to comment on the latter, but let me say that people-to-people contact is not a bad idea. These are two countries which are very large, which claim to have very long standing historical ties and so on. But actually speaking, people have very little exposure to either country. There are lots of cultural, linguistic barriers and so on. So to that extent, it's a good idea. But I think what is even more important is the agreement to set up sort of state-level committees, between China and India, which I think is even more significant from the perspective of getting a much more fine-grained perspective of where the Chinese will want to invest in India, where they want to put their money in, who are they going to be dealing with at the local level. I think that kind of knowledge can be really useful in terms of, your question about translating those $20 billion of promise into actual investment in India.
One of the things that exists, at least on the Indian side, I don't know if it happens on the Chinese side, is that there are a lot of Indians, maybe a majority of Indians, I can't say for sure, who actually have a sense of prejudice about China, or at least wariness, particularly after the '62 war. When the Prime Minister says that, in fact, we don't know each other, much less understand each other, do you suspect it's the Indian attitude to China that he has very much in mind?
Well, I think it runs both ways, right? I mean, in a sense that just as Indians are possibly too fixated with the 1962 war, from the Chinese perspective, that doesn't seem to loom at all in their consciousness. So it's imperative that both sides discover what their history and political reality is. But I think equally it's important that the government of India should sort of start educating Indians about what the reality is.
Now, Pramit Pachodi, the other development that may not have got the attention it deserves, but it was there both in the Prime Minister's speech in front of Prime Minister Li Ka-shing and as well as in the joint statement, is the proposal to hold regular summits.
Yes.
Is that an important development?
Yeah.
And I suppose regular summits would mean that one or other head of government will be in the other country every year.
Yeah, no, I think what they have, I think that broadly in the joint statement, there's a basic message here that we may want to do things like the boundary, we may want to do things on various other issues, but there's an enormous degree of distrust between the two sides. And we need to solve this partly by these greater exchanges. As Srinath has mentioned, one of the proposals is that there should be state-provincial meetings. There's even a reference to the Ministry of Justice and law enforcement agencies working closer together. There's a reference to media delegations, senior media delegations, because the media on both sides are relatively hostile about each other. And it goes on and on. There's a long list of attempts to build that, should we say, civil society cooperation that actually does not exist outside the state structure.
This long list you're referring to is proof of the seriousness of intent. This is not just rhetoric in a statement.
Yeah, it's a recognition by both sides that they have a trust deficit that's quite enormous, and that until at least that is minimized, you're going to find it very difficult, for example, to even tackle a boundary dispute, let alone something like military cooperation in the future.
Very quickly, Zorawat, let's say, how significant is the setting up of an India-China forum for state-provincial leaders, which, as Mr. Modi said, it's the first time such a forum has been set up by India with any country. So, right. In your eyes, how significant is it?
It's absolutely. That's the central plank of translating interstate commerce and investment to the ground level, right? So, the fact that he's taken two chief ministers, he's in some ways trying to emulate China's strategy, which was based on a balance of centralization and decentralization, and what he calls cooperative federalism here. You have to translate that and bring out different stakeholders from the bottom up into this process of engagement. So I think it's absolutely essential.
So when you say it's absolutely essential, would you say that of all the many developments, this top three as an outcome that to be
This is
noted?
Certainly relevant, because if you're serious about attracting FDI, and if you are taking your chief ministers with you, then you're showing that you're committed at multiple levels of the political structure.
In that context, how unfortunate is it that the Karnataka chief minister, who also been the only non-BJP chief minister, didn't go?
It's unfortunate, but I think the significance of this development lies more in India's domestic politics than at the international level.
By which you mean?
By which I mean, you see, the way the Chinese provincial governments operate vis-a-vis the center is very different from ours. In the case of China, special treatment was given to selected coastal provinces. That's simply not possible in India. And this was done in China through a decision of the central government, not the state government.
So what you're saying is that the real significance of this forum of state-level leaders is that it's a way of ensuring your states in India cooperate with the center, and more importantly, opposition-controlled states cooperate with the BJP government.
Precisely.
Which means that the Karnataka chief minister not going actually weakens this initiative.
Well, yes, it could have been, a fuller initiative had he gone. But there were two chief ministers present.
Both BJP?
Both BJP, but it's a start. And I think you'll find other chief ministers finding it to their advantage to climb on board. Tamil Nadu may well be the next one.
All right. Mr. Dasgupta, let's come to an area where there seems to be confusion, and I'm talking about e-visas. After the Foreign Secretary bluntly at his press conference said, no decision on e-visas for China as yet, the Prime Minister, just about an hour and a half later, at his university lecture, announced that e-visas for China were going to happen. Now, is this an instance of confusion between the Prime Minister and the Foreign Secretary? Or is it an example of an impulsive decision taken by the Prime Minister without telling his Foreign Secretary? And either way, would you agree, it doesn't look good?
Well, I frankly don't know what the background is of these apparently conflicting statements.
None of us do.
But did the Foreign Secretary state no decision has been taken as yet?
No, well, yes, he did say so, but are you telling me that it was taken in 1 hour?
Well, I mean, what I mean is logically it opens itself to that interpretation.
I'll tell you why that interpretation may not hold water. I'll tell you why that interpretation may not hold water. Here, and I'm holding it up, is the Prime Minister's speech at the university. It was available on the Prime Minister's website literally within 5 minutes of being delivered. And the speech has in writing the sentence which says that in fact e-visas will be given. It says, so we have decided to extend electronic tourist visas to Chinese nationals. Now if the speech could be put up on the website 10 minutes after it was delivered, It was clearly written well in advance. So was the Foreign Secretary not aware? Or did the Prime Minister impulsively add this in at the last moment?
It's certainly one of the many mysteries surrounding China, events in China. It needs clarification. I don't know how that happened.
Let me bring you in on that, Pramit.
Well,
When this sort of confusion happens, does it suggest a certain lack of proper working? Or is it something only journalists play up because it's a little bit of fodder for us?
Well, this sometimes, let's put it this way, this type of mismatch can be a problem if it's a major issue. And the best example I can think of would be the Sharm el-Sheikh statement we did with Pakistan, where they included a clause on Balochistan, which then blew up in parliament in India 24 hours later, because the government had not bothered to explain to its own cabinet why exactly this line was there, and Pakistan, of course, played it up. E-visa obviously is a relatively minor issue. My sense would be, and I'm guessing here, is that normally when you negotiate, for a diplomat, reciprocity is important. And my sense would be that India would say, we'll give an e-visa, what are you going to give in return? And getting a Chinese visa is not easy. And my sense is the Chinese, for whatever reason, were basically stalling.
But how does that explain the fact that within an hour and a half of each other, the Foreign Secretary and the PM contradicted each other?
Then it's a political decision by Modi that I'm going to make a unilateral gesture.
And that's perfectly entitled. The Prime Minister is entitled to make a policy decision during his trip. I mean, and this is something which links
you're suggesting that the PM made the decision after the Foreign Secretary?
It's very possible, and I think it's frankly, there's nothing, I see nothing wrong with it.
There's nothing wrong in the Prime Minister making a decision.
It becomes a unilateral gesture.
It feels odd that your Foreign Secretary should have said the opposite of you an hour earlier.
We will find out what the details are, but if it was made after that, it shows that you made a proactive decision, and maybe there was a debate and he swung
I think he decided, as sometimes politicians, political leaders do, I'm not going to get tied up with this bureaucratic reciprocity. I'll just make a unilateral gesture. Let's go for the e-visa.
And the unilateral gesture you're saying was made after the Foreign Secretary made his statement?
Yeah. So the Prime Minister says, okay, we don't have this, but I'm going to go ahead, even though China may not be giving me something in return on that.
Sanjay Baru, let's come to another couple of areas where there was not confusion by any means, but perhaps silence and perhaps no progress. First, I'm talking of China's Silk Road and Maritime Silk Route initiatives. Now, we know that India has reservations about these, but as far as I can tell, neither the joint statement nor the comments made by our Prime Minister referred to these two initiatives in any way. And when they were brought up at the press conference, the Foreign Secretary didn't brush them aside, but he simply said these were Chinese national initiatives and they don't have anything to do with us. Does that suggest that on these two issues, the Indians and the Chinese are significantly far apart?
Absolutely. I mean, this is a substantial issue, Karan. I mean, e-visa, whether Jaishankar knew 1 hour before what the Prime Minister was going to say, I mean, that's a mountain out of a molehill. It's entirely possible that Jaishankar said that no decision has been taken, and immediately thereafter a decision was taken. These things happen in government. So I think you spend too much time on the e-visa issue, but this is a substantial issue. This is substantial because for China, the Silk Route initiative, the Maritime Silk Route and the land-based Silk Route initiative has been a major initiative. Chinese have asked me in the last few months what my view is on this, which is what they're doing all around India with people who think about these issues to gauge public opinion in this country on that initiative. They have been trying to get India to also join in on this because after all our neighbors are very much part of this initiative. This is a fundamental geopolitical initiative that China has taken, and it's been in the making for the last 4 or 5 years. And the fact that there's no reference to this in the joint statement, to me, is a very clear message from India that we are not yet convinced that this is about trade and investment. We do think that there's a geopolitical angle to this. Therefore, convince us, build trust in us, let us understand what exactly you have in mind, and let us see what you're doing in our neighborhood. Then maybe we'll come on board. But I think that the absence of any reference to the Silk Road initiative is a significant thing.
Now, Sridhar Raghavan, another area where a lot was expected, and I personally can't make up my mind whether we've made a good start or whether it's a disappointing outcome, is the possibility of a big-ticket railway investment emerging out of this meeting. When you look at the joint statement, It talks about cooperation on speed raising on the existing Chennai-Mysore line, a feasibility study for high-speed Delhi-Nagpur rail. It talks about redevelopment of 2 stations. It talks about heavy haul transportation training and a railway university. None of that to me sounds like big ticket investment at the moment. So are we disappointed by the outcome, or could you say these are things that could lead to something big sometime in the future? The potential is there, even if it's not actualized at the moment.
Well, the thing about railways is that both sides seem very interested in it. The Chinese are very interested because they have a lot of surplus capacity, they have expertise. On the Indian side, railways have been sort of very central to the Prime Minister's infrastructure plans. As far as high-speed rail links and such things are concerned, the whole issue of feasibility studies is not to be slighted. There are very significant cost implications. We need to work out very clearly whether this makes sense for India at this stage. Maybe improving speeds might be actually a better alternative. So I think the process which is being set out here is a good thing. And this is an area of interest for both sides, and I think it will go forward.
So if expectations here are a little disappointed, as I was suggesting, that's probably because the expectations were unrealistic.
Yeah, or they're not in position to be met at this point of time.
What about this whole question, Zorawar Daulat Singh, of sharing of river water data, which is particularly important to us? The Foreign Secretary said, if I understood him correctly, that although we get flood season data, the Chinese and us have a different idea of what is the flood season, right, which effectively means that we don't get what we want. Now, when I look at the joint statement, all it says is, and I'm quoting, the 2 sides will further strengthen cooperation through the expert level mechanism on the provision of flood season hydrological data. Does that mean we will hereafter get the data we want? Or is this just diplomatic gobbledygook to paper over the fact that we haven't got an agreement?
Right. So on this issue, I think there is some kind of a lack of there is a dissonance here. And I think one of the things we've seen in the recent years is the concept of the upper riparian and the lower riparian. I think the Indian side is still finding out how to negotiate and get the Chinese to cooperate on this. I wonder if maybe the Arunachal issue could also be a factor, and are the Indians by slight trying to link it up? Because I don't know, if possibly that could be one factor. Where
You
if
think
you're
that's
trying
a
to
suspicion on the Chinese
I don't
side?
know. Maybe that could be if you're trying to get it legal, but I think on a purely tactical, functional basis, there's no reason why that data sharing can't happen.
Let me bring to you this question, Mr. Dasgupta, of a separate statement on climate change. I believe you're an authority on this subject. Given that China has already announced its national targets in a separate joint statement with President Obama not so long ago, what did we gain? Or does the gain for India actually come out of the fact that the Chinese have allowed us to continue with our previous position and there's no pressure on us to announce a peaking year as they've already announced?
Absolutely. And more than that, the Chinese have reiterated their support for the basic principles on which a Paris Agreement, a Paris outcome should be based. Essentially, what we are seeing in the climate change negotiations is the developed countries pressing for an agreement which is far distant from the Framework Convention and Kyoto Protocol, whereas India and China have reiterated that we want an agreement which is as close to the existing arrangements and is based on the same principles.
But then if I understand your answer correctly, the fact that this separate statement on climate change was made without any pressure being put on India to accept national target dates is actually a plus for us.
Absolutely, it is.
And a significant plus.
It's a significant plus. But the Chinese, even after signing that joint statement with the United States, they've been very supportive of our position in the last round of
And that support is underlined in this joint statement.
Absolutely.
So this is something Mr. Modi can come home very pleased about.
I think so.
Let's come then, Srinath Raghavan, to some sense of an overall assessment of this visit. It's not over by any means. There is the whole Shanghai visit that will happen tomorrow onwards. But as of this evening, what is your overall impression of the way the visit has gone?
Well, I think Mr. Modi's visit has laid a foundation for him to be able to do many more things in the 4 years that he has ahead of him. In the first instance, there has been this emphasis on building trust between both sides by increasing contacts. They have agreed that outstanding issues like the border will have to be settled. In fact, there is a very strong paragraph on that which says what needs to be done. And as I said, they've agreed that India-China relations have to be situated in a global framework. Issues like climate change. More importantly, there was also a small reference to coordination on bilateral issues in WTO, which is quite significant. In fact, Mr. Modi, in his speech in the Tsinghua University, said that India and China are the greatest beneficiaries of globalization, and that if there is a downturn, it is going to affect both of us. So which, again, goes against the sort of Trans-Pacific Partnership, TTIP, etc., being put on the table by the United States. The attempt by the Western countries to change the rules of the game, India and China could work together again. So I think these are very, very significant issues.
Sanjay Baru, many people, not just journalists, will probably compare Mr. Modi's visit to China with Mr. Modi's visit last year to America. They will compare the way the relationship with America has transformed and ask whether the relationship with China is going to transform the same way. What would be your answer to that question?
Well, first of all, I agree entirely with what Srinath Raghavan has just said. So building on that, I would say that if this visit of Mr. Modi to China is generally seen as a positive visit, it will be because his visit to Washington a few months ago was actually seen as a positive visit. In other words, China will pay attention to India only if India has good relations with other major powers. And indeed, we do have good relations with the United States, with Russia, with Japan, with a large number of other countries, other emerging economies like Indonesia, like Brazil. And I think it is that aspect of India's external engagement that forces China to take India more seriously, despite the enormous gap in our economic levels. China is 5 times bigger than India. It's a much more powerful country today. And yet, China is required to take note of India because of all these other relationships. And so in that sense, Mr. Modi's visit to China would be a success because all his other visits have been a success.
Let me put to you, Pramipal, what is, I suppose, a journalistic question, but it's irresistible. What would you say as of now is the single most important, single most significant outcome?
I think I'd be more analytical. I think the attempt to recognize that, or the recognition that the distrust between the two countries makes solving almost any of the bigger issues very difficult. So you've got to address that first. And they try to build that into the joint statement with very specific institutional structures. And I think that's both a question of contact plus the economic issue. And I'll just highlight one other...
So before you carry on, have trust levels as a result of this visit significantly risen?
Well, we'll have to see polling evidence, but my sense is that if you look at the polling data, India actually, about 2004, 2005, a plurality of Indians actually admired China. They thought what China had accomplished was very good. And then in a period of roughly 2008 to 2011, it dramatically drops because of the border issue, the visa problems, and so on. And by 2011 and 2012, China is right next to Pakistan in the view of the Indian public. Now, going back to where we were 2004, 2005 is my sense of what they're now trying to accomplish.
Let me ask you the opposite. As someone who's been ambassador there, as someone who understands Chinese politics, the way the Chinese system works, and someone who knows India's requirements and needs, what's your biggest disappointment so far? Or is there none?
What is my biggest disappointment? No, I don't think there's any disappointment as such. I think the visit met expectations. There are no expectations of spectacular outcomes. The expectation was of constructive outcomes. And I think that has been met by the visit.
The media undoubtedly, Zorawar Daulat Singh, will play up the language, the candidness, the forthrightness and directness with which the Prime Minister said to the Chinese Prime Minister, you need to change the way you look at India.
Right.
Will that be the memorable moment for the Indian media?
I think absolutely. I think India for the first time is taking charge of its foreign policy when it comes to China. Rather than drifting along, you're actually making a choice that you want to transform relations. You know their problems, you know their common interests, and both have to work together. So there is definitely a political will to reset that relationship. It will take time, but I think that the first time we're seeing a political level decision to engage with China and locate it as part of a wider foreign policy.
Then as a corollary to your answer, do you believe that Mr. Modi has put a distinctive Narendra Modi stamp on India's China policy?
Absolutely.
In a way in which Dr. Manmohan Singh never did?
I think the novelty now is you're building the relationship from the bottom up, the people to people, the civilization. You're trying to find a new narrative to get past that 62 image that is still embedded in the majority of the Indian sort of people.
So is this another foreign policy feather in Mr. Modi's cap?
It's an investment, and let's see how long it takes to reap
Is an
it.
investment a feather, or is this too much of
I
a
think
simile?
no, it's definitely a positive, one of the more positive events in the last year.
Sprig that could become a branch.
It's a sprig that could become a branch.
If there's actual implementation for a lot of what's going on.
An acorn that could become an oak.
Tree.
All right,
I'll just-
gentlemen, now that we're getting carried away with our own fancy, it's time to end this particular show. My thanks to all four of you for joining me. My thanks also to Sanjay Baru. And if you have been, thanks for watching. Goodbye. Good night. President, for the first time ever, has travelled outside the capital to receive a visiting leader.
Well, I think the latter part, his traveling to Xi'an to receive our Prime Minister, was a reciprocal gesture because Mr. Modi had received him in Gujarat. And Xi'an is also a very appropriate place to start this sort of a venture, both because it recalls the historic contacts between China and India, and also because it will play a central role in the new Silk Route, the new
What
Chinese...
about the pageantry, the banquet, all the entertainment? Was that special?
Absolutely. I believe Amir Khan is in China these days to do a joint venture film with the Chinese. I think you could pick up some very useful tips from Chinese protocol officers on how to create a spectacular backdrop for scenes.
So this is in fact special treatment for the Indian Prime Minister.
Well, I don't know. He might do it again for another visitor. But the Chinese mastery of creating spectacles, we saw that in the Olympics, and you're seeing something of that repeated here.
Srinath Raghavan, let's come to the Prime Minister's statement. He said China is one of our most important strategic partnerships. After admitting that this is a complex relationship, he then added he was committed to set a new direction. How do you read this commitment to a new direction? Hello and welcome to a special episode of To The Point, devoted entirely to Prime Minister Modi's visit to China. Yesterday, the Prime Minister received an unprecedented and spectacular welcome from the Chinese President in Xi'an. Today, he's had far-reaching, but even possibly path-breaking discussions with the Chinese Prime Minister in Beijing. So how should we assess this visit? What should we make of the decisions on the border dispute, trade, investment, and people-to-people contacts? And are India-China relations hereafter on a significantly different trajectory? I have with me a panel of guests who are perhaps better informed than most others. They are India's former ambassador to China, Chandrasekhar Das Gupta, the geostrategic director of the IISS, Sanjay Baru, a senior fellow from the Center for Policy Research, Srinath Raghavan, the foreign affairs editor of the Hindustan Times, Pramit Pal Chaudhary, and a research fellow from King's College London, Zorawar Daulat Singh. Mr. Das Gupta, before we come to the details of what's been achieved, as well as the areas where perhaps not that much progress was made, let's start with the incredible welcome and reception that the Prime Minister's got from President Xi in Xi'an, and then today from President Li in Beijing. Was China, in your eyes, sending out a deliberate message through this grand reception and through the fact that the election?
Well, I think what the Prime Minister was trying to say was that, this is a relationship where you have elements of competition, elements of cooperation, and that you really need to sort of try and mitigate the competition bits, and accelerate on the second. And what he's trying to do really is a set of things. I think the other thing which Mr. Modi has really made an attempt to, which I think we must recognize for what it is also to try and set the India-China relationship in a wider global context. For instance, the decision to issue a separate joint statement on climate change, I think is quite significant. It suggests that India and China can work together on the global stage on issues which are of vital concern to each other. And that itself sets a new compass for the way the relationship will develop.
But when you talk of setting a new compass, when the Prime Minister talks about setting a new direction, is that in fact an indication that he wants to either lift this relationship to a different trajectory, or he wants to reorient it so that it is significantly different in its handling to the way it's been handled in the past?
I think it's a bit of both. He does want to bring in new elements which will give it greater sort of depth, complexity, more dimensionality, but at the same time try and press ahead on issues that have been outstanding for a very long time now.
Sanjay Baru, the Prime Minister said something that I found particularly important, and I'm going to quote him to you. He said, "I stressed the need for China to reconsider its approach on some of the issues that hold us back from realizing the full potential of our partnership." And then he added, "I suggest that China should take a strategic and long-term view of our relations." Now there clearly the Prime Minister is publicly calling on China to change its attitude to India, but not necessarily in... Normally these are things said behind closed doors. Here it was said publicly on television. Did you not find that both courageous and unusual?
Actually, no. Let me correct you. You know, in some senses, this was the message from India in the period 2003 to 2010. When Jiabao met Manmohan Singh, and we're talking about the whole world is looking at India and China. When India and China meet, the whole world is looking at us. You look at the rhetoric of that relationship in that period, there was a lot of this at that time. But what has happened in the last 4-5 years is that India has gone down. People start giving up on India. Okay. And on the other hand, China has become more assertive, much more self-confident, and under Xi Jinping, a much more powerful nation. And so there was a certain reassessment probably that, China is now here to stay. Is the G2, United States on the one side, China on the other side, the superpowers. India is just like any other emerging economy, not something that one should take too seriously. So I think Prime Minister Modi is basically saying, no, don't take that view of India. We are back in business, and take us a little more seriously.
Pramit-Pal Chaudhary, in response to the two statements that I've quoted of our Prime Minister, right, Premier Lee said, "We have more in common than our differences." Additionally, our Foreign Secretary at his press conference revealed that Premier Lee had admitted that the image of the two countries in the past was that of adversaries. Right. Now he wanted them to project a positive partnership. Yeah. Do you therefore get the feeling that in terms of sentiment, in terms of broad vision, the two indicating whether he's going to make a similar change beyond this talk of a new commitment? How do you read this public comment to China?
No, I think you read it absolutely correctly, Karan. This is really Prime Minister Modi at the end of 1 year of going around the world, to Japan, to Russia, to the United States, to all the other BRIC countries, finally going to China and saying, take a long-term view. We are here. We are a rising nation. We are a growing economy. We are Asia's biggest democracy. We are your neighbor. We have survived 60 years as a democracy. Take us seriously. Take a long-term view. And don't try to needle us, unnecessarily in our neighborhood. Think about India and China in a 100-year perspective, 200-year perspective. From beginning of civilization, we have lived in peace. And just because we have had some problems in the last few years, and just because you have grown at a phenomenal rate in the last 30 years, that's really in the last 30 years. I mean, China's takeoff, no country should be assumed that it will continue to take off. So please take us a little more seriously and take a long-term view. And we are going to be around, both of us are going to be neighbors forever and ever and ever. So let us live in peace.
But my point in a sense was that not just is the Prime Minister telling China to take a long-term view and that we're around for a long time with each other, but this is the first time I remember an Indian Prime Minister publicly telling his host to actually reassess and relook at the relationship.